So, in the opening line of the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto, Marx wrote that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Now, despite that, Marxism as a theory of history has often been taken to be a theory of economic stages through which every society must pass. And in this view, technological development is the primary driving force. So from that premise, it usually follows that there's a scheme of linear development in which economic stage follows economic stage with definite political forms arising upon each. This model, in fact, arose before Marx among 18th century Enlightenment thinkers. But Marx did more than just build upon that deterministic model. By introducing class struggle as central to the story, he fundamentally altered it and escaped the rigidities of determinism. If you think that technology itself determines social relations, then you assume that where you have a steam engine, you have industrial capitalism. And where you have a bronze-tipped spear, there you have an agricultural economy ruled by a palace civilization. In Marx, certainly the political is bounded by and rooted in the economic, but development does not proceed in a simple linear way, but in dynamic and contradictory combinations. So in the deterministic view, the missing concept is that what Marx introduced, that people make their own history, but not under the conditions they would choose. So it is an active process, not one merely determined by what level of technology you have. And proceeding from Marx's concepts there, we can bring in Trotsky's theory of united and combined development, because it is in fact a direct consequence of Marx's ideas in this respect. So the starting point for Trotsky was late 19th century Russia, where you had a quite backward economy and state structure, which was suddenly confronted with the growth of most modern industrial forms springing up suddenly in its midst. The problems of the old society were therefore combined with the problems of the new. And Marx had anticipated this as early as 1844 when describing what happened in Germany in comparison to Britain. He said, "We suffer not only from the living, but from the dead." So in Russia, this meant in practice that the acute social conflicts of a peasant-based society were combined simultaneously with the stresses of a modern industrial economy. The result was explosive class struggles over the direction that Russia would take, how the new and the old would relate and resolve the social contradictions. Now, some Marxists want to limit the application of united and combined, uneven and combined development. I should have been saying all along. Uneven and combined development, claiming that the apparent examples of it outside of later industrial capitalism are just examples of simple uneven development, which is a constant phenomenon that you get anywhere, anytime. However, this ignores the fact that uneven development actually creates naturally conditions for a combination of old and new economic, political, and ideological structures. The patterns of development from the most ancient centers of agricultural settlements and then the arising class polities in the Middle East westwards through Europe show repeated pulses of new technologies and forms of social organization. These collided with older forms, which absorbed and resisted them, the new developments in ways that created singular social political complexes, which hadn't been seen in the older centers. So we have not here in the ancient world either, a linear deterministic progress, but novel and combined forms. So the standard ways in which historians of development treat societies is as if they were individuals. So you look at the growth of an individual along certain expected stages. But in fact, you need to look at societies within wider systems in relation to all the societies around them. So, in fact, relations of production generally exceed the political frontiers of a state. They're not bounded by it. So before capitalism was fully developed in England, the country was already enmeshed in the slave trade, connecting Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Capitalism emerged within an international web of relations, not in an isolated way in English towns and estates, as some historians have, in fact, tried to locate it. So similarly, the great ancient civilizations created a web of trade and connections across a very wide area, creating a periphery around them that was really an integral part of a single economic zone. There was, if you like, a kind of mini globalization of production relations early on in human history. So sometimes it is assumed that the spread of agriculture itself brings class society. And indeed, class society was one response, but it wasn't the only possible one. Moreover, class society did not automatically win the field. Early ones were prone to frequent collapse back into more egalitarian forms. So one example of this is a very early city, Kyonu, in southeast Anatolia, which appears to have been a quite nasty class civilization, not only with palaces and temples at the center, but featuring human sacrifice as well. But at some point after about 8,000 BCE, this city was destroyed, evidently, possibly the buildings were destroyed and possibly even burnt. And it was replaced by a much more egalitarian settlement without those sort of central palace architecture and temple. So this may have been the first revolution, in fact, in human history. And all the most ancient class civilizations seem to have leaked population at a dramatic rate. Their armies, the necessity for professional soldiers was more through a need to keep the population working in the field and stay where they are than they were necessarily for war with other cities. So, in fact, the first impact of the emergence of exploitative social relations was to strengthen the attraction of the egalitarian tribal societies on the peripheries. So rather than a kind of linear development, you get class in one place and it spreads naturally onwards. In fact, you had a contradictory result of the strengthening of egalitarian society on the periphery of the new class societies in the center. This is therefore a version of uneven and combined development that, in a sense, it works in the opposite direction from the Russian example, but it is nonetheless proceeds from the same contradictory relationship with the impact of new technology. Thus, even as the Neolithic spread across Europe, the Neolithic being kind of package of technologies going along with agriculture and domestication of animals, it produced new political forms in non-linear ways. One of the most dramatic are the Atlantic cultures from Iberia through up to Brittany and southern Britain, which produced megalithic monuments, which inspire awe even today. So structures like Stonehenge were most likely, in fact, expressions of communal purpose rather than the creations of elite coercion. So their very circularity implies their use as gathering spaces for communal decision-making, gathering and redistribution of surplus, and so on. So these look, in fact, like they are ways in which the peoples of these regions try to maintain egalitarian relations across perhaps a cluster of tribal groups, rather than being the expressions of the development of new elites arising on top of new technology. They were, in a sense, a reaction against that possibility. It is, however, the Bronze Age which perhaps illustrates the patterns most clearly. Bronze most commonly is an alloy of copper and tin, neither of which are very common, and tin in particular is actually relatively rare. They are also not usually found together. So the ruling classes of the Fertile Crescent therefore needed to establish quite long-range trade relations in order to get the supplies of both copper and tin and bring them to where they're needed. Now, in these old centers in the Fertile Crescent, bronze solidified a class society based around a centralized state and a warrior elite, as the full panoply of bronze armor and weapons was only available to a limited few. But the demand created for a range of products, not just metals, but timber and furs and precious, various other precious stones and so forth, did create a large amount of demand for craftsmen. So this created the possibility for sort of imitations, such as you find in the palace-centered states in Greece and Western Anatolia in the second millennium BC. Now, the existence of this new class civilization was predicated on there being clusters of specialized craftsmen under the control of kings. Now, these kings would have been no more than tribal chiefs without that concentration of craftsmen, which was wholly dependent upon trade with the greater centers nearby. But the palace states were therefore not merely copies of the older civilizations, but new forms arising from the dynamics created by the older ones. However, exploitative social relations did not spread widely or even intensively in the earlier Bronze Age period. Even close to the old civilizations like Egypt, you find pastoral egalitarian societies like the Midianites, and Moses famously was married to a Midianite woman, and these societies were able to preserve their social structures, even though fully involved with trade with the pharaonic state over the long term. Further west, the impact of long-distance trade was much more ambiguous. There are some signs of nascent elites emerging in Iberia, particularly in the second millennium BC, but plenty of evidence for the persistence of essentially egalitarian structures. In Britain, in southern Britain, even close to the tin mines of Cornwall, which which were connected to the Mediterranean long-distance trade. But here we find that the most ancient field systems that archaeologists are able to identify preserve very definite equality in the packaging. So you have these things called reeves, which kind of zigzag along the countryside in sort of unpredictable lines, but each one clearly responds to the zigs and zags of the other, preserving a basic equality. If you had some kind of class civilization here, you would have had clear signs of an estate, a center within these lines, carving out a dominated area of land. Instead, you have these bundles of egalitarian zigzags. So there are some signs of higher status individuals here and there, but on the whole, it seems that these elites that emerged in the Western Mediterranean and Atlantic coast were wholly dependent upon trade with the East. So here we have a kind of form of center-peripheral dynamic. The peripheral elite depended upon the income derived from long-distance trade to develop internal clients and patronage networks in their own societies. but they are in effect sharing the surplus created by the exploitative relations in the far distant class civilizations. They don't seem to have been able to establish true exploitative social relations in their own societies, beyond perhaps probably quite limited degrees of household exploitation and some limited domestic slavery. So the prestige goods they received from the East did not fundamentally alter the redistributive social role these elites had, and instead tended to reinforce that role as their status was sustained really from gift giving to sort of favored families within their purview. There were, of course, however, periodic crises in the ancient civilizations. And when this long-distance trade was interrupted, cultures like the Hallstatt culture, which stretched from France north of Switzerland all the way over to Hungary, or the Tartessian states in Iberia, they suddenly disappear, they collapse, leaving not really much sign of any class society behind them. So the new technologies of the Bronze Age created new class societies in the immediate periphery, Greece, and then later the Etruscans in Italy. But even close by, they also tend to create a reaction, preserving egalitarian structures against the spread of kings and exploitation. So different political forms were being created here in unpredictable ways as the new technology impacted upon older social relations. So this, again, is a pattern of uneven and combined development. So we have to spread our analysis wide across a super-regional span. The dynamic created by Bronze Age class societies enmeshed peripheral societies in a new web. The result was a familiar historical pattern of barbarians invading developed societies and periodic civilizational collapse. The peripheral elites' only means of reproducing their status came to be finds ways of accessing a share of the surplus from the real class societies. And in times of crisis, this would mean the beginning of armed raids upon the older centers, often resulting in barbarian conquests of older centers. For example, the Hyksos conquest of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. The repeated pattern of growth and collapse of civilizations in the ancient world, producing various so-called dark ages, was produced in essence by social struggle. The pattern of repeated disappearance of elites in the periphery is a sign of the reassertion of communal egalitarian values in tribal societies. This is history as the history of social struggle, as Marx declared. In the Iron Age, these patterns became elaborated still further, but iron made possible a much swifter and deeper spread of exploitation than before. Despite that, the first impact is the final collapse of the Bronze Age elites on the peripheries. Iron is much more common than the constituent units of bronze, and once the more sophisticated techniques required for its manufacture had spread, there's much less need for dependence on long-distance trade. Technology, therefore, has contradictory impacts depending upon the social relations that encounter it. So the first reaction to iron was a kind of technological democratization, and only later did new elites begin to form on the back of iron technology. The impact of iron was therefore threefold. Again, similarly to the Bronze Age, you had a renewal of the old state-centered class societies in the East. Secondly, you had the emergence of new forms of city-states in the Levant and Greece, which created a new form of class society where slavery became more important, and they quickly began to establish colonies in the Black Sea and the central Mediterranean, and so forth. Thirdly, you have the reassertion of egalitarian tribal relations further west and north. These developments all depended upon the nature of social relations in these areas in the previous centuries. So the social relations of production do not simply arise on the basis of new technology, but previous forms absorb new forces of production in contradictory ways. There is no one-to-one deterministic relationship between technology and social political structure. The Iron Age had more in store, however, and the combination of new tools and more productive agriculture with the elaboration of slavery created a new monster that spread class society much faster and deeper than ever before. This was the development of the slave mode of production, whose first leader really was the Phoenician city of Carthage. But the Greek and Phoenician foundations spread the slave mode of production throughout the Mediterranean world, particularly the western side. And it was Rome which inherited this already existing relations of production. And Rome was, in fact, in that sense, dependent upon it. The Roman Empire is, in that sense itself, a product of uneven and combined development. Nevertheless, it was the new political organization in Rome that was finally able to stretch the slave mode of production to its ultimate limits. So again, we have a repeated pattern of the old dynamic of the barbarian periphery, dependent upon the class society at the center. Around the major frontiers of Rome, barbarian societies with militarized leading groups have become dependent upon trade with Rome and dependent upon subsidies from Rome to maintain their elite status. Like their equivalents of the Bronze Age, they were unable to turn themselves into true ruling classes within their own society, so were drawn always ever inwards into the Roman Empire, where exploitative social relations were much more stable. Firstly, they came as federate troops. Then they became supporters of one ruling elite faction against another. And finally, as plunderers on their own account, trying to carve out their own little kingdoms using what remained of Roman relations of production. So just as the collapses of the Bronze Age led eventually to new class societies and new state forms, the Roman period ended with the old Roman infrastructure combined with mutated social relations through the Germanic invasions to result in a new form of exploitative society, European feudalism. So while political superstructures do absolutely rest on economic foundations, these cannot be read off in a mechanical manner, but depend upon the complex and dynamic relations of different social forces. New technology does not automatically produce new social relations. Technology is received in different ways by different societies, and the shape its impact takes depends upon social struggle within a given global context. So just as the bourgeois revolutions in the 19th century unfolded in different ways with different political results, so different forms of society emerged across the ancient world in response to the evolution of class societies and the responses of egalitarian tribal society to those. This created contradictory results. But the eventual victory of exploitative social relations in the ancient world should not obscure the long millennia of resistance that shaped and delayed the outcomes along the way. The leading role played by resistance and class struggle across this huge swathe of early human history should give us hope for the future. Technology on its own will neither determine utopia or dystopia. Rather, resistance now can shape what kind of society emerges from the crises of the present. Thank you.